Have you ever heard someone say, I felt like I lost myself in that relationship? Or maybe you have felt that way yourself? Well, it turns out nobody is just being dramatic about this. There's actually real science behind it. Relationships literally shape our identities. And when they end, it can leave us feeling totally lost because of that. But the good news is that you can rebuild yourself and use this experience to operate differently in relationships going forward. And today we're going to talk about how. My guest is Dr. Morgan Cope, and she has a lot to say on this subject. So trust me, this conversation is going to change the way you think about heartbreak and relationships, possibly forever. Dr. Cope, thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's fabulous to
Yeah,
be here.
thank you. Well, I'm so excited. When I first found out about you and your research, I got genuinely excited because of your focus of research on heartbreak and relationships, but also seeking to understand some of those big questions around, like, why do I feel the way that I do in a really, I think, unique way? So we're going to dive into all of that. But first of all, I wonder if you could take just a minute and introduce yourself to our listeners, because you're up to some really cool stuff.
Oh, thank you, of course. Yes, I'm Dr. Morgan Cope. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Center College in Danville, Kentucky. And I am also a relationship scientist. So I have a master's degree in psychology and a PhD in experimental psychology from Florida Atlantic University. Graduated in 2024, actually. Just last
Mazel
May.
tov.
Oh, thank you. Yes. And I have been publishing research on identity in relationships since 2020. And we have been diving into the intersection of the self and how our understandings of who we are change when we get into, maintain, and sometimes end relationships.
Yeah.
And I'm really passionate about this work. I love it so much because it is very personal, and
Yeah.
relationships and the self is just this really exciting point and a nexus of human experience, and they're quite integrated, as we found out. I also teach courses in social psychology, sexuality, cults, and statistics. That's me.
Will you come back on the show sometime to talk with me about cults?
Yes, maybe we can talk about the cult of toxic relationships.
Oh,
Yes,
I'd be down for that. Okay.
absolutely.
Oh. Well, so many interesting things we could dive into, but I, again, was just so fascinated by one facet of your research, which is really around identity. So, our self concept, meaning really the relationship that we're having with ourselves in many ways, and how that is developed or sometimes damaged in the context of having relationships with other people. And one of your hypotheses is that relationships, when they end, these breakups, they're not just breaking your hearts, they're actually breaking or damaging your sense of yourself. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that, because it's something I experience frequently in my work as a therapist. When relationships end, people are obviously devastated by the loss of their partner frequently, but they also feel like they've really lost something fundamentally important about them and their identity and their life. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that and just why breakups often feel like so much more than losing a partner. What is going on?
Absolutely. So when we get into relationships, we go through a process that we call in research inclusion of the other in the self. And you can imagine, usually we represent the self in the shape of a circle, which I think is pretty beautiful. It can expand, it contract, and it's this dynamic being that is you. But when we include another person, you can imagine two circles becoming an overlapping Venn diagram. So if you're watching the video, we've got two circles, and you become closer and closer as you initiate and maintain romantic relationships. And this, while the relationships are intact, is really beneficial. You go from I and me to the emergent we. And that lets you be this united front. You and your partner, you're a team, you're a unit. And that dyadic cohesion is really adaptive. and will promote longevity and relationship maintenance.
Actually, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Of course.
So I'm imagining forgive me, I'm a very visual thinker.
Yes,
so I'm imagining as we're talking, there are these two circles, two little orbs, and they come closer and closer together. And they meet cute, they start a relationship, and then there turns into some overlap where there's me, there's you, but then there's the us, that like place in the center.
Yes.
Is there an ideal overlap, or like does it become problematic if there's too much fusion?
Excellent question. Everyone will probably have a different ideal level of inclusion with their partner. This has been found in differences with attachment styles. People who feel like they want to be super close to others, maybe to an extent where they feel like they need others to be okay. Super close. People that we might describe as having anxious attachment with a partner want to be so overlapped, right? That they're practically one circle.
Right.
That I am a we. I'm not me. It's always you and I.
Got it.
And to some extent, you might say live and let live. If that's what you want and that's what your partner also wants, because you could have asymmetries and ideal overlap with your partner. Some people might want to be super close, whereas others might want to be further away, and that might create conflict.
Yeah.
Oh, where am I going? But the other side of this is attachment avoidance, where you fear being close to others and you want to maintain your autonomy. Like where you're really into that feeling of independence, and you getting close to others makes you feel uncomfortable, then you want to remain pretty separate in your circles and not have a lot of overlap. So for relationship functioning, in fact, it's interesting. Like, we don't want to construe it as a static being like, oh, one day we'll reach this ideal level of self-other overlap and it will be that way forever. In fact, what I guess my professional opinion is that you should be able to oscillate and have flexibility in your understanding of yourself as an individual and as a relationship unit. Because that way you can go from interdependence to independence and have a broader tool belt for approaching your goals with yourself and your partner.
And is this even another way of understanding what we mean by secure attachment is that flexibility? And I know I'm me and I can also be a we, but it's not rigid.
I think that's a fabulous way to think about it. I think that it does allow you to have that understanding of the self, but then you're comfortable approaching and comfortable with intimacy, but you don't need that person to know who you are. And that ability to move back and forth, I think, ultimately would be really adaptive for both individual and relational functioning.
Yeah. This is fantastic. And I'm so glad that we're even starting with this, because I know that attachment styles and attachment theory is also a big component of your work.
Yes.
But I think also this is one of the terms that, and you may have opinions about this as well, but like in popular culture, people are throwing around like attachment style language. And sometimes I fear that there's not a full understanding of what it really means. And so I just loved you defining it differently on the show today for our audience, is that it's really around how you are relating to people in relationships, and not just with them either, but like how your own sense of self is a part of it. So thank you. Thank you for doing that.
And to be sure, I did diagnose myself with avoidant attachment in college. I read about it, decided
we
that was me.
We all diagnose ourselves with everything when we go through counseling school.
I was an undergrad. I was in my third year of my undergraduate education, and I was in this relationship science seminar, and I read about it. I was like, wow, that really is me. And then I started to behave more that way. Even like, it felt true to an extent, but then I sort of manifest this identity for myself, which definitely had implications down the road. Reading about it, I'm so glad language is becoming available and more accessible to people to understand themselves and their relationships. I want people to know about attachment, but I don't want it to be this diagnosis we informally internalize and then sort of create realities we didn't necessarily have to.
Oh my gosh. This is so good though. I mean, okay, this tiny bit of a tangent, but like, I'm so glad, because as soon as we start creating labels and ways of understanding ourselves through these types, and this can be through your astrological sign. I am an Aries, therefore I am an Enneagram 7. And so that's what this means about me. And it really kind of like, no, really, it starts to kind of crystallize ourselves in this way that may or may not be helpful. And so to be very careful about these self-imposed labels that you are putting on yourself, because it kind of, I don't know, we were just talking at the very beginning about how flexibility and some psychological fluidity is very healthy. And anything that you put in your life that deprives you of the ability to do that might not be in your best interest, including labeling your attachment style.
I agree. And it's like taking the Myers-Briggs personality, pretty much any personality assessment that gives you essentially a non-formal diagnosis at the end.
Yeah.
Where, oh my God, I'm such an INFJ. Well, I'm an ENFJ. But also, it's so unhelpful to think that you are the same in every single situation across every point in time. Kurt Lewin, historical, awesome, dynamical social psychologist. People's behavior is a function of the person and the environment at a specific point in time. And you change any of those factors and that behavior will not be the same.
Absolutely.
So there's just so much dynamism in how we act. And yes, we're all going to act anxious and feel anxious or avoidant sometimes. That doesn't mean you have anxious attachment per se. Maybe you do. You got to talk to someone about that. Maybe you, not me. I don't do clinical, but I think that
you can talk to me about it.
It's important to understand just because I feel anxious doesn't mean I have anxiety. I'm drawing that line for people. It's freeing. You're allowed to feel these things. You don't have to run years down a relationship rabbit hole with it.
Oh, so refreshing to talk to you. I'm having such a good time right now. Okay.
Me too. Thank you.
So then coming back to the idea of identity construction, and which we were just talking about, our self-interpretation of our attachment styles and relationships, how they could show up. I know we want to talk about how identity when it comes to breakups can be a flare-up, but maybe first you could talk a little bit more about what your research has uncovered related to how our relationships help us form our identities. Can you say a little bit about that?
I can. And I will say that I didn't do the original seminal work or publish a seminal paper on this. My undergraduate research advisor turned collaborator, Dr. Brent Mattingly at Ursinus College, published a paper along with Kevin McIntyre and Gary Lewandowski, they're professors respectively, on the two-dimensional model of self-change, which is a fancy, social psychologists, we love to just make up terms and assign them to things that are kind of intuitive, because it just means that you can add or subtract good or bad content from your self-concept or your identity. So when we're in relationships, especially, we will take on traits, characteristics, values of our partners, and we'll also maybe shed some parts of ourselves ultimately to become more similar to that person. Because similarity, while opposites can attract, it can also create conflict sometimes. So ultimately, we like people that like the same things we do. So we will go through this process. So if you're adding positive qualities to your identity, say your partner loves jazz music, so you start going to jazz bars with them, and that's a good thing for you. That is self-expansion. Our self-concept, our circle is growing in a way that is bringing us towards our ideal self, the person we want to be. But if you are maybe taking away negative content, it's also what we consider an improvement process. Again, working towards that ideal self, where say we were a really bad procrastinator, but we have a partner that's super diligent about their time management, we become less so. That would be self-pruning, also called the Michelangelo effect, because we're full of ourselves here in academia. And then, so these are too, improvement processes. On the other flip side, we've got what we call degradation processes, which is just ultimately bringing you further away from your ideal self, maybe quote unquote getting worse. Not that you're a bad person, but we're changing in a way that is not bringing us to that ideal self. So if you lose things that you like about yourself, I used to be an avid runner, but I've stopped doing that because my partner wants to spend time with me, and I love them, so I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna prioritize that. If that is something that feels like you've lost a good part of yourself, that can affect your relationship and ultimately your satisfaction. And then the final kind of fourth quadrant of this two-dimensional model is taking on identities that are negative. So if you perceive, let's say, smoking to be a negative habit, and you start smoking because your partner does, then that might be an instance of what we call self-adulteration.
Yeah.
And these four processes ultimately are going on across relationships in our lives. We're always being influenced by our surroundings, but romantic relationships especially if you're anxiously attached, you will actually spontaneously take on more identities from a potential partner to be more similar to them, to promote closeness.
Why? So this is fascinating. And I will also just say more a confirmation of my theory that there is nothing in life that cannot be solved by a good 2x2 matrix. Like everything.
They're everywhere.
Everything.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But with regards to the attachment style, so you're saying that natural process is that we are influenced by our relational partners, no matter what your kind of security level.
Sure.
However, if you are more on the anxious side of that bell curve, you're going to be more porous, almost more flexible in terms of your modification of self in response to your partner. Why is that?
Well, so there's in the attachment literature, one way you could construe it is that individuals with anxious attachment may have a more negative view of the self overall, and they want to change themselves to be able to take on another person. So it's sort of this malleability based in maybe some lower self-esteem. And it might be true for everybody. I like to think about it more as just this almost, it's a tool. It's a tool for fostering intimacy. Oh, you love rock music. I love rock music. Oh, your favorite food is pad thai. I love pad thai. And it's just this, it sounds silly and it's not always that overt, but just the willingness to be whoever anyone wants you to be can be really attractive in the short term if you're trying to maintain a relationship, or initiate a relationship. Because in maintenance phases, it's might not going to work so well. It's hard to keep up being someone that you truly aren't. But I do think that that is a big part of it, that you feel that you need others to help you regulate your emotion, and you feel that uncertain sense of self. Maybe you have an incomplete sense of identity, and you're like, well, I'll just become more like this person, and they will get with me, stay with me, and that'll be our relationship.
Right.
And that'll be me now.
Wow. Right. So it's almost like an adaptive response. I will be pleasing. I will dazzle you by holding up this mirror that confirms all these things about you that I also like, but you're also saying at what expense to the self long term if it's not genuinely congruent.
And we all do this to some extent in relationships that are important to us. You know, if your boss really likes cakes, you might bring them a cake to get on their good side. It's not pathological.
Finding common interests. Yes.
Right. But when you're losing that much of yourself to the point of loss of identity, and it's undercutting your understanding of who you are, I think that's worth reflecting on.
Definitely. Well, and now we're getting to this really interesting piece because, I mean, obviously we can foresee the relational problems that can come out of this way of relating to people, particularly if you're heavy on that anxious attachment side, or also, I mean, truly you're describing some of the symptoms of a borderline personality disorder, which is a highly unstable, sense of self and ability to kind of conform to this chameleon-like personality. And this is an extreme. And this is also a spectrum, right? It can be like a little bit that way or a lot that way. But can you tell us a little bit about some of your research into how this way of relating and conforming oneself in the image of a partner can then have an impact downstream when that relationship ends?
Yes. So if you can imagine, our two circles have become one. That Venn diagram that's maybe super overlapped where they're nearly one circle. When that relationship ends, the content that you integrated from that romantic partner is stripped away. And you're left with a little sliver of a half moon for your identity, right? That if you made your partner in your relationship yourself, when that no longer exists, that's extremely distressing. And it can lead people to do all sorts of weird things, which I'm sure we'll get into. But ultimately, even if you have, let's say, a moderate amount of overlap, it still is going to probably make you feel bad, confused, hurt, and mourning for that relationship, but also for the person that you were when you were with your partner. And you might not, anything from sort of high level questions of who am I now? How do I move forward? To these lower level details of, who's going to make dinner? What should I watch on television? What is my weekend going to look like? You have to rearrange your whole situation. And I think that's a really big part of breakup, that sometimes we can maybe come to terms with the fact like, I'm going to have to move on from this. But then we think we see their car driving down the road and we panic. Oh my God, is that them? And so I think that's a really big part of it, that identity is being taken out from your self-concept, and you're left with this incomplete understanding of who you are that you then have to recover. And people do that in a bunch of different ways. We can maybe hold off on that part for now.
Well, so I have a follow-up question. I'm hearing what you're saying. So there's a ton of overlap, probably more than is healthy. And it is that one person has been the iron core around which the other person has conformed, is what you're talking about. And if some of the identity development, adding positive things or potentially changing ourselves in response to our partner, are there also times in which those endure? Like, I was with somebody who was really good at time management for 3 years, and I am better at time management now, whether or not we are still have our toothbrushes in the same cup. Do you know what I mean? Like, can we just speak about this, like what persists versus, because I think I'm hearing you say that there's like this internal collapse, that it all goes out the door with a partner, but is that true?
I don't have the data to speak to an empirically supported statement. But I do what I don't. So I do have evidence, because there's this really cool study that was done, I believe it was 2007. And researchers looked at individuals who had different numbers of Facebook relationship status changes, essentially people that had multiple partners. And it turns out the more partners that individuals had was correlated to the number of Facebook interests that they had indicated positively.
Interesting.
So you see this, I don't know if it's spurious, but it's kind of cute, where it potentially, the more partners you have, the more identities you pick up along the way, and you can choose to let some go when you break up, or you can choose to hold on to some. I know, like, my music taste has been heavily influenced by the people that I've been with. I think that that's such an interesting way to get to know it. And food as well, like different types of food from different cultures. And those are things that, we don't always let everything go. And I like that you brought this up, because I think it's a good point. But I will say I don't have data or an understanding of what makes people decide what identities to keep. I would hope that it was things that made you feel confident and more sure of yourself. We could also pick up some bad habits from partners as well.
Vaping.
I
hear you, but no, that maybe it's been like internalized in a positive way. Okay. And so many aspects of identity that kind of go along with this. But I think you were also about to describe how, like, what this can do to people. And so there's also, I would think, internal identities and what I'm into, what I do, how I operate, but also external things like friend groups, hobbies. We always went snowboarding together, and now I don't have a buddy to do that with, that kind of thing. An identity as a coupled person versus a single person, which I know you have some insight into as well. But what does this do to somebody when these things start to become fragile or fall away altogether?
All right, I'm gonna do a little note here. Mental, physical, and single.
Oh, sorry. I know, because I asked you like 27 questions all bundled into one. It's one of my superpowers. Yeah.
Of course. So if we look at the consequences of breakup, I'm going to go through some mental health effects, physical health effects, and then some controls of singlehood. There is, and perhaps you've talked about this with your audience before, it's pretty well known that experiencing a breakup is one of the most severe stressors that people can undergo. Social connection is crucial for our survival. If you are reading evolutionary psychology journals, social connection keeps us alive. If you're in a hunter-gatherer situation, you see a lion and you're on your own, you're more likely to die. Now, that is not to say you're going to die if you break up. That is to say the feelings that you're feeling may be based in this social rejection and the fact that social rejection is an indicator of flashing red light. In this evolutionary context, this might be a problem for you moving forward. But that in the literature, experiencing breakup has been linked to feelings of depression, anxiety, loneliness, suicidality, onset of substance abuse, and that's all very sad. We also see, so that's the negative effects. Physically as well, I have some cool data that I do plan to publish in the coming months from my dissertation, looking at the longitudinal effects of breakup on physical health.
Interesting.
It's very cool. It turns out that the closer you are to breakup, the more physical illness symptoms you report. So your body, and likely due to a stress response cycle, negative thoughts, negative physical feelings, but every pain is brain pain. We experience that physical effect of breakup just like we experience the mental effects, but people will report things like stomach aches, headaches, joint pain, gastrointestinal issues closer to the time of breakup than they do, I would say, in the 2 months following, which has been interesting data to look at because we can see actually how it changes over time.
You could see that.
Some positive effects, though. Breakup is interesting because I'm a kind of a breakup enthusiast, right? If you're not happy in your relationship, it is my full belief that you have every right to change that. And if that means not being together, so be it. And when you're leaving an unhappy relationship, it can be very freeing, and you can actually experience what we call post-dissolution self-expansion, which is just after you break up, you engage in those self-expanding activities with friends, with family, with yourself, alone.
Yeah. And so it's in civilian terms, like, why didn't I do this sooner? Okay,
yes.
Got it.
or you do the breakup bangs, or you start dressing a little differently, or you just make these changes in your life that ultimately make you closer to understanding who you are.
Yeah.
And that is, those growth processes are super important. If you've broken up and your identity has shifted from relational, like I was a person in a relationship, to I was a person, or I'm now a person who's single. I think that's really interesting, and I feel like it's something I should study now. But ultimately, that's going to have a lot of sociocultural influence because our country and our culture loves to have people married and in relationships in a time where we're also highly individualistic. So it's like, you need to be unique and you need to be better than everyone else, but also you need to make it work with someone who's trying to do the exact same thing and stand out but fit in, and everyone's just getting whiplash. And so this identity of singlehood is probably demonized by media, pop culture, I don't know, the powers that be. But for me, as a researcher, I think that singlehood is a really exciting time, especially as an identity researcher, because if you are not sure of yourself and you're not able to understand who you are without any other person, your relationships are just not going to be that adaptive for you, because you're always going to be looking for someone to define you, not to have a partnership with. And you'll get yourself in all sorts of sticky situations, some potentially physically threatening. Because above all, we like to have coherence and certainty, even above comfort. So you might be okay feeling uncomfortable or sad because you're trying to figure, you'd rather that, because at least you know what's going to happen in that relationship day to day, than be alone and not know if you're going to find someone else. And that to me is an ultimate
it feels
disservice.
like you have to completely. And I hear what you're saying, and glad that you're saying this out loud, that our collective efforts to strengthen ourselves, clarify ourselves for ourselves, be in alignment with our values, and generally happy and living the lives that we want is a prerequisite for having healthy relationships, because otherwise you become very vulnerable to this identity fusion that is not good for you. And I will also say, as a marriage and family therapist, objectively not good for the relationship either. That kind of
Yes.
fusion creates all kinds of problems in terms of relational dynamics. But you're saying that if this is underdeveloped in yourself, if you have bought into these cultural ideas about the importance of being coupled or have not had the time and space to really work on yourself in this way, you will then have this almost existential fear for being single, will rush into new relationships, potentially to your detriment. Or also an interesting hypothesis that you've brought up is that it can lead you to perpetuate unhealthy relationships that really probably should end, because there's this fearfulness letting go that's above and beyond the relationship itself.
Yes, and in fact, we do know or have evidence for the idea that people who are anxiously attached specifically and fear being single will further commit to and amplify commitment in relationships that are unhappy. So we only see this in people that don't have that fear of being single, right? If you're not afraid of being single, you're not going to commit to a low quality relationship. But if you are, we do have evidence suggesting that you will go from dating to exclusive. Like, oh, maybe I'm afraid someone's cheating on me. Let's move in together. Oh, this relationship, there's a lot of conflict. Let's have a child. And these commitment amplification trajectories, right, which is a fancy way of saying just getting to the next milestone and the next milestone, can certainly be driven by individual feelings about yourself. And I think that's a core intersection of the work that we do in my lab, looking at the personal reasons for relational behavior.
Okay, well, just to clarify this, so what do you make of that when it comes to the sense of self? We're fighting all the time. We hate each other. So I think we should have a baby. What is somebody trying to change within themselves through that?
I'm going to go
dynamic
back to this idea that behavior is a function of the person and the environment at a given time. If you feel that, so the behavior you want to change, you're not willing to change the person, which is you and your partner. So you're going to change the environment by introducing a new variable, the child, and hoping the behavior is going to change.
I see.
I think that's what's underneath a lot of that. So you're going to have to choose. Am I going to choose to change the way the person's is, my tendencies, my habits, or the environment that we're in? Oh, I'm unhappy in this relationship. I'm going to move to a new city and everything will be different. The thing is, no matter where you go, there you are. And it's really going to be tough if we're not willing to reflect on those individual tendencies and we just keep changing our environments. We cannot run away from ourselves. Unfortunately, we're here to stay. That doesn't mean you can't change yourself. But then you got to go see someone like you.
But so you're saying that the fundamental thing that's going on is that there's this powerful attachment, and that because of these internal needs, we can't explore maybe ending the attachment. So therefore, I'm going to start moving and having babies and planning weddings in hopes of finding some magical solution for the...
I would say so.
Got it.
Because for these people, remember, me is we.
Yeah.
And that can't change, because if we're not here, I'm not here.
Yeah.
We can't break up. So we have to change what's surrounding us.
Now, when people do break up, and as something that I see, particularly if somebody has a highly anxious attachment style, they begin behaving in ways in the relationship that are very difficult to maintain that relationship. And so say their partner is, I don't want to do this anymore, and exit stage. What then happens? So I heard you talking about a lot of emotional distress, physical symptoms, but I'd love for you to explore some of the potential pitfalls. I mean, maybe trying to get back together, even in the context of a relationship that really is not sustainable nor should be. But additionally, is there a happy path, like in terms of how else could we handle that?
Yes, I can. So I do have, I guess, probably my most well-known paper on relationship rekindling. And this line of research that we're doing and extending on, that people will get back together with an ex-partner, especially if they're anxiously attached or high in attachment anxiety. It can be high and low in both of these dimensions. But essentially, what rekindling allows you to do, imagine we have our moon, our concentric circles that have overlapped, and we've broken apart. You're left with your little half moon that's a very certain shape that used to be full of certain identities, a specific partner. And instead of self-expanding with new self-concept content, with new identities, new experiences, friends, etc., you can simply replace and reinstate that identity, that content from the partner that was there before. It lets you go back to things the way they were, even if they were bad. Right? Because sometimes we're prioritizing that predictability over comfort. And so rekindling is something, especially these on again, off again relationships, or, it's easy to fall into this relationship cycling or churning because you break up and you say, well, this is impossible. I need this to be back together. I need this relationship to get back together so I know who I am. But then nothing changes.
Right.
And it's not going to work because you broke up once before. And if you don't change anything, that those tensions are still there. So then you break up and get back together and you're oscillating on and off and everyone's tired. Right? And so that's one of these situations where I believe it's 1/5 of married couples have broken up and gotten back together at least once. It's totally possible and common, but it's something that if you find yourself in a cycle that is leading you to be perpetually unhappy and dissatisfied, it could be because you're trying to define who you are again and again, instead of actually approaching a loved one or trying to make a relationship itself work. You're just trying to get yourself back to an understandable level of coherence and comprehension.
Yeah.
I will say also, so that's rekindling. People also can rebound to new relationships. And there's some fun evidence on this because, as it turns out, rebounding relationships are very self-expanding. So it's actually sort of a neutral thing, if you want to think of it this way, to go out and try and meet new people, because that you're not stuck in that on again, off again cycle. Now, if you're perpetually rebounding and just trying to get another person into that identity and I'm going to pick my next, doesn't matter who it is, just matters that they're breathing and alive.
Earthling here.
Yes, that's probably not adaptive. And because you still aren't building up that self. But there are identity benefits to getting to know new people. And that's
definitely
important. If you're looking for things that might actually help.
Yeah. And I hope that let me restate that. I hope it is an unfair question because I know that you are a researcher and so you're seeking to understand what is happening and maybe why it is happening. But then I think that the clinician's realm is that then how do we make that be different next time? But from what you've gathered in your research, are there any potential best practices for somebody who perhaps has lost themselves in a relationship or has had a pattern of doing that goes into the piece of either rebuilding or building a solid self-identity with understanding of the fact that even attachment styles are not at all fixed, that there is a high degree of flexibility and in different situations, they show up in different ways. Just because your father was a narcissist does not mean that you are destined for a life of, having weird relationships. That is just not true. And there's a lot of emerging research to support the fluidity of this. So with that hopeful idea in mind, and if somebody's saying, I need to work on strengthening myself before I get back into that rodeo, what would be your hope for them? Like, what could they do?
It's funny because in research, we just label it self-expansion and just move on. We're like, oh, you should self-expand. Have fun figuring out what that looks like.
On that. Well, and maybe it isn't a fair question, but what?
Totally. I think from my perspective, it would, so you can self-expand. And then also I've done a bit of research on immersion in a past self. We're not starting from nothing. We did exist before relationships and partners. And so you can also revisit some identities that existed before that perhaps you lost in a relationship. So if you're that runner that stopped running and when you got together because you didn't have time, go back and do that, or play an instrument, or read a book from your childhood or adolescence that was informative to who you became later in life. Yeah. And I think immersion, we don't have maybe so strong enough evidence yet for it, but I'm excited about the idea because I think that's important to just remember that people, they come and go, but we will always be here.
Yeah.
And then we being me and the self.
Yeah.
And for self-expansion, they're just different. You have to look around and what's available to you, which is a little tough because there's differential access to self-expanding opportunities, whether that be because you live in a rural area, because you're queer, because you have to take care of a sick parent, you only have so much time in your day. You really have to decide what that looks like for you. But I think it is possible to do little things. When I went through my post-high school breakup, I cut off my I cut bangs in my hair and started straightening them.
The
Horrible
glow
idea.
up.
Yes, the post-breakup glow up. Some people start going to the gym. This is a little cheesy, but it works. It's weird. Start painting your nails a different color, or I don't know, if you've got facial hair, do a different style. Things that express who you are and how you feel in a way that is now symbolizing this is the next me. And it could change.
Exactly.
Right? And those are
I love small things,
yes.
but also particularly when they're outward facing. I mean, it is an identity representation, how you're showing yourself to the world. And, even changing your hair, your clothes, your nail color, it may seem superficial in some levels, but not really if it means something to you. So I'm glad that you're bringing that up. And I'd also, because this is something that I frequently do with individual clients or in a more structured heartbreak recovery program, is really going into this. Who are you now? Getting clear about your values, your identity, and then how do you intentionally craft a life in the image of that is coming from you, as opposed to an externally defined sense of self. So I really appreciate this.
Absolutely. Something I did when I was on winter break from teaching is I was also feeling kind of stuck in this identity rut of something was not being fulfilled or something was incomplete. And I was like, I just don't know what it is. And so I went online and I got a list of 50 values, just words, value words. And I started the ones that were important to me. And then I put those in a different list and I indicated which ones I felt like I was fulfilling to the extent that I wanted to as a person. And I sorted all those out. So I was just left with the values that I felt like I wasn't fulfilling at the time. Yeah. And I said, okay, out of these values, which ones can I address right now versus what's just going to take time? Because some of it is notoriety in your career. And that's, I'm 27. That's just, it's going to take some time. And so those things got sorted out if I couldn't address them right away. And I was left with, I think, adventurousness, openness, and another one that I'm not going to remember. But the principle being that you can systematically assess, and perhaps there's a formal clinical way to go about this.
You're life coaching yourself, Morgan. This is literally an intervention that is exactly a values assessment. Yeah, and figuring out how to then create it. Yes, you had an intervention on yourself. I love it.
But then I was able to try and brainstorm ways that I could specifically address those areas with actionable things like, I'm going to spend time with these people and go to this place and try this new thing. And I think that can also point you in the direction of immersive activities, things I used to do, as well as, because maybe it's things like connection to others. Maybe you want to spend more time with friends or family. That's huge after a breakup. There's also a social need that needs to be filled. Right?
And on that note, this is a terrible question to ask, but I have to. Okay, so remember at the very beginning when we were talking about your research and teaching on cults?
Yes.
Now, to bring this all the way full circle before we let you go, is this same these internal vulnerabilities and ways of relating that we've been talking about, and also the identity needs that can be met in relationships. Is this part of the pull of getting involved in a cult?
Probably depends on the
Like the
cult.
group as opposed to an individual like fusion? Or is this me just like making crap up?
Can you ask it one more time?
Oh, so my curiosity question,
Yes.
and maybe this is so far out the bounds that
No,
you're
no,
like,
I
I don't
think
know
we
what we're
can
talking
get
about
there.
right now.
My brain was
But
like immediately
is
went
it part?
seven.
Is it part of the internal process that we're talking about? So that anxious attachment styles and seeking to create an identity through another, is that part of the internal process when somebody bonds fiercely with a cult, the charismatic leader that you're going to be, Morgan, in another 20 years? No, I'm just kidding. You want it. Notoriety was like on the values list. I mean, I don't know where you're going with this, but like, is that part of it?
Yes. So identity exists. When I teach social psychology, which I'm about to on Wednesday, and we're going to start with the fact that identity exists at 3 levels of analysis: the individual level, the dyadic level, and the group level or systems. And when you're talking about the individual level, it's who am I? Who do I understand myself to be? What is my self-concept? All the stuff we talked about. The dyadic level or interpersonal level, right, with another person, how does my understanding of with myself affect how I interact with, let's just say, another individual? Bring in all of the identity and relationship discussion we just had. But also, your identity is constantly interacting with this group level systems and communities around you, because we integrate group identity into our sense of self. Oh, I'm a professor. Oh, I'm a researcher. I'm a runner, or name any. But we can also do this with sports teams or musical artists. And this is how you get people with parasocial fanatic fandoms. And if you can fulfill a fundamental psychological need, which we understand to be autonomy, you got to feel like you're able to do things on your own. And not interdependence is important, but it is, we got to be able to navigate the world. Competence, that you're good at things, and relatedness. Cults offer at least one of those 3 things. So if you're talking anything from the extremes, Jonestown, they were providing people with food and a place to live and social relationships, and ultimately that ended terribly. But to things that are super unserious, I listened to this podcast. It's called Sounds Like a Cult, hosted by Amanda Montell.
I've heard of that. I need to listen to it.
I have all 3 of her books. Fantastic author. But she does this podcast where she talks about some less severe, just culty culture. So she talked about the cult of Stanley Cups and how Stanley Cups establish an identity, and especially adolescent girls and women as, I don't know, financially affluent.
No, but it's like, cool. What does it mean about me that I have the specific Stanley Cup?
You're part of the group. You're part of the Stanley cult, Stanley Cup cult. You subscribe to this social group. And so I do believe that whether it be an individual cult leader, Charles Manson, anywhere from him to, I hesitate to ever say anything about Taylor Swift. She just says such a powerful.
She really does. I have a 16-year-old niece, man. It's real.
Respect. I think she's an incredible business person. But from kind of moving down the spectrum of cultiness, that it is our identities and our need to fulfill all of these very human motivations that will end us up in groups that are willing to give it to us for a pretty cost.
A monthly subscription, if you're lucky.
Likely.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
That's so interesting. Well, but maybe that's the big takeaway from this entire conversation, is to be aware of vulnerabilities, be aware in yourself of these needs, and also tendencies to try to get these things met through people, through relationships that are maybe not that great from you, or groups. And, you can decide on, is this bad for me or not? The Stanley Cup, who cares? Like, it's fine. But also just to be paying attention to, is this actually in service of my well-being, my life goals, but that you have to stay connected to who you are and what that is, because without that, you become very vulnerable to being in relationships that are not good for you, or when these relationships end, falling apart in very dramatic
Yes.
ways and perhaps doing things that are to your detriment, seeking reunion, getting into other relationships, and slow down and work on building a self.
Yes. And I think that exit costs are really something we talk about in deciding whether or not something is going to be borderline culty. Does it matter? Like, what happens if I leave? What happens if I leave this fandom, this relationship, this cult compound I've moved on to? Do I lose financial resources? Do I lose identity resources, social support, whatever it may be? And if so, like, again, interdependence is so important. I'm really not here to make you stand on your own on a cliff and just exist in isolation. That's not realistic. But if you are not able to be autonomous, there are plenty of people willing to sell you that dream and that promise, whether it be romantic relationships or a corporate
multi-level marketing schemes.
There's documentaries out the wazoo about this thing, and it's just people who get involved in anything from the LuLaRoe legging scandal to toxic relationships. They're just all looking for human needs. And they're not less intelligent, they're not less worthy, and we're all just out here doing our best most of the time.
Absolutely.
We do have to take responsibility for our understandings of ourselves, so that we can.
And that starts with awareness, honestly, because, and that's why I'm so grateful for the conversation that we've had today, is because I think that in my own experience, and probably in yours too, and that of our friends here who are joining us today, it's like, the things that we're talking about, like, they're not operating consciously. They're just things that we reflexively do without reflecting on why. And so that's one of the reasons I think why therapy or really high quality coaching can be so helpful, is because it pulls that into the awareness around, why am I doing what I'm doing? But I think also to be listening to things like this and conversations, like, it also shapes identity. It creates this psychological distance in some ways, where you can observe yourself and be like, I might do that. And that is so powerful, because without that, we're really like stuck in the washing machine with all the things and like the churn, and you can't really see what's happening.
Yeah, research is me search. So audience and Lisa, we are all here because I rekindled a relationship I shouldn't have. And
really?
Yes. And this person was beautiful and amazing and loving. I did end up rekindling a relationship in my, it must have been like 6 years ago now. And then living with that person for a year, mostly because of the pandemic. And it was the wrong decision. And I remember I did it because when I broke up with them, the amount of mental and physical distress that I felt was unbearable. I thought, if I feel this bad, it must have been the wrong decision. So let's just press the rewind and undo. And I don't know, I hope that's comforting to at least some people. Yes, I research this stuff. Also, I do it for a reason. It's because I've been wanting to understand why I've done things in relationships. And we were talking before this started that I'm a quantitative psychologist. I collect data from, in a given study, 500 to 1,000 people, and having them report things that I've experienced as well. I can talk to my friends about what I'm going through, but I love asking 500 anonymous strangers if they also feel that same way. And sometimes my hypotheses don't always work out, but I think if you read our work that we've published, you will. It is comforting. I know it's in academic language, and we're trying to do more scientific communication, which is why I'm so pleased to be here. But there's comfort in our data.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And just forgive me. I'm gonna therapist you just for a tiny second here, but because one of the things I heard you say is, that was a mistake, I shouldn't have done that. But I'm over here thinking, really? Because it expanded you. It helped you grow into this person that you are. Just like opened up this whole new door of, that was weird. What was going on with that? And that the world would not have the benefit of all of this work had you not had that difficult life experience, and I'm certainly not happy that you went through any of that. I mean, it sounds like it was very challenging challenging. And I think we're all carrying some of those stories. I can certainly relate. I have those of my own, but it's not just that these things happen or that we make air quote mistakes, but that this is actually the growth process working inside us. And it is how we become who we are and get clear about something like, for you, your actual life's mission. Or at least at this stage of it that you're in now. So it's such a beautiful thing. And I would not take that away from you.
Thank you. That really does mean a lot to me. And I've never thought about it that way before. I think that in my mind, I frame it as something I wish I don't know. I guess I'm here in an office as an assistant professor, something I have worked, I guess, 9 years for.
Amazing.
And all of it is based off of my experiences, and I'm a big feelings person. So these big feelings I had that sometimes I wish I could feel less or get rid of some of those negative emotions. But ultimately, I strongly advocate for the adaptive outcomes and benefits of negative emotion as motivation, and not like mindset, grind sets, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like that's a little toxic too.
But unproductive self-torture. Yeah.
Yes. But this isn't my therapy session.
No, but it's good. And again, particularly that I'm glad that, and thank you, by the way, just for being so authentic and vulnerable here with me today, but also for the benefit of our listeners, because I think too, somebody going through this experience feels so catastrophic, so painful, especially in the early stages of this growth work, really don't know where they're coming or going. And it's difficult to imagine, what is my life going to look like on the other side? Am I always going to feel this way? And I think that, and I would not say this to someone in a one-on-one conversation in the early stages of this, because it would feel so like tone deaf. Do you know what I mean? That your pain is valid and we need to stay there. We need to work with it because that's important. But in the further stages of this, it is time and time again, is when people live through hard things and allow themselves to be evolved by the experience in really productive and positive ways. It is a beautiful thing. And we can't define at the beginning of the journey or know for sure what that will look like. But as somebody who's just walked with people through that so many times, like, it is so real. And I think it is very hopeful, even if you don't know where that journey is going to take you at the beginning of it. You could become an associate professor and research psychologist. So I get
you might as well get a PhD
or
about it. I don't know.
Exactly. Careful now. This guy.
Can't.
But
not going to wholesale recommend that.
Yeah, definitely. This is a tough career choice, but anyway.
No, it's the best though.
Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. This has been such a fun conversation. And any parting words for our friends here, or did we do it?
Oh, I think we really did it. I appreciate you having me on again, just getting to talk about the work we do. I'm at a small college in a small town, but our work is very big and I think at this point, we're reaching a lot more people, and that's super exciting. And as we go through the next day, month, year, we're going to be confronted with a bunch of situations that, I don't know, are challenging, and feel like breakup. A lot of the times we think of breakup as only romantic, but in fact, we're going through these evolutions and these identity transitions in a bunch of different ways. So just looking around, and if something's not working for you, whether it be a romantic partner, a friend, an ideology, like you can break up with that thing and know that there's work out there that says you're going to be just fine.
That's wonderful advice. And so now, if people listening to this wanted to learn more about you and keep up with the work that you're doing, the research you're conducting, some of your findings, what are the best ways to stay in touch with you and learn about that?
Yes. So my lab, the Relationship Science Center, spelled CENTRE, the French.
Very British.
I know.
That.
Well,
Okay.
Our school was from the 1800s, so we're traditional here, or historical rather. We are on Instagram at relationshipscience.center. Again, CENTRE, all one word, no uppercase. And that'll be the best place to keep up with those research. We were also recently published in CNN. We've got some stuff coming out in Self magazine soon. So just look for us in these. We're percolating through these mainstream outlets. We're gonna get there.
Excellent. You're on your way. Well, thank you so much. This has been a delight, and I can't wait
Thank
to
you.
see where this continues to take you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate it.